That evening, the forest breathed cold, and every branch beneath my feet reminded me that I didn't belong there. My son said he'd return at dawn, but when I fell and couldn't get up, I understood. He had no intention of coming back. I lay on the damp ground, feeling time erase everything I had done for him. But mourning didn't bring salvation. It brought a scream that didn't break my heart. It broke his. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Arthur Collins. I was 74 years old, retired from teaching American history at a public high school in southern Ohio. For over 40 years, I'd spoken to teenagers about the past, wars, speeches, the slow crawl of justice through time. I used to believe in structure, in consequences, in the idea that people who gave their all would, in the end, be remembered kindly. I held on to that belief long after I stopped holding chalk, long after the desks emptied and the last bell rang for me. But in the years that followed, life itself became my final lesson, and some of its teachings came slowly, like erosion, wearing me down without noise. That morning, I sat on the porch of the small ranch house where I'd lived alone for the last 9 years. My wife Ellen had passed in her sleep one March morning, and since then, the silence in the house had grown roots. I filled my time with simple things, folding laundry with unnecessary precision, organizing old lesson plans I'd never teach again, and staring too long at a wall that held no answers. The creak of the porch swing was the only sound that reminded me I was still moving through time. I watched birds. I counted steps. I waited for things that rarely came. Then came my son, Brian, 38 years old, full of plans and forward motion. He had a jaw clenched so tight it looked like it resented every moment not spent climbing. His visits were short, clipped affairs filled with glances at his phone and comments about how I needed to get outside more. "You're stiff because you sit all day," he said the week before. "You've got to get your blood moving, Dad." I didn't argue. I never did anymore. I nodded and said sure. Maybe he was right. So when he pulled into the gravel drive that Saturday morning and said he had a plan, I got in the car without hesitation. I wore an old flannel jacket and sturdy boots, the same kind I'd worn on field trips back when I was still Mr. Collins to kids with notebooks. The drive was long, past the edge of town, and deep into the rural stretches that folded around Wayne National Forest. He said he knew a spot, a loop trail, easy, with views of the creek and shaded paths that were good for thinking. I liked the sound of that. I liked anything that sounded like it would make me feel something other than still. The road narrowed until the car rocked with each bend. Trees reached overhead like quiet cathedral beams, their tips brushed with early autumn yellow. The air smelled of soil and pine bark, sweet and damp. I breathed deeper than usual. Brian parked near an old wooden sign with peeling letters. I had to hold the car door longer than I used to before standing up. My right knee clicked, a dry warning. He offered me a walking stick from the back. It was heavier than I expected. We entered the trail without fanfare. Just the two of us, him walking fast enough to make me shorten my pauses. I didn't want him to see how hard it was becoming. I used to walk miles in a day. Now every incline whispered against my joints. The woods around us thickened with each turn. The light filtered through the trees in slanted bars. I liked the way the sun painted the leaves gold in some places and left others in deep green shadow. It felt like I was walking through a painting I had no part in making. I tried to ask about his work, about how things were going with his wife, but the sound of my voice felt too large for the quiet of the forest. So I kept it inside. I noticed instead how he didn't look back, how his feet crunched forward without adjusting to mine, how he breathed like he was chasing something. I knew that look. I used to see it in students who thought life owed them momentum. After half an hour, my breathing grew heavy. My lungs were not what they used to be. My boots bit into the damp soil, and the trail narrowed into a dip, slick with old leaves and stones. I said nothing. I kept walking. I had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the only way to remain standing. The path curved around a slope and descended toward a darker patch of woods. Trees leaned closer together here, and the sound of the wind faded, replaced by the hush of needles brushing against one another, and the occasional snap of something unseen moving through the undergrowth. I stepped carefully. Every footfall required thought. I told myself I was fine. I was always fine. That was what you said when no one had time to listen. At one point, we passed a weathered bench made of 2 planks nailed into old stumps. Brian didn't notice it, but I did. I remembered benches like that from my youth, makeshift resting spots built by hands that didn't care for comfort, but needed a pause. I wanted to sit, just for a minute. But I didn't ask. I kept walking, pretending my breath wasn't shallow, pretending I wasn't counting how many steps I could take before my ankle reminded me it had limits. The deeper we went, the more I felt the forest watching me. Not in a haunted way, but with the steady observation of something ancient. Trees don't forget. Stones don't move for anyone. And the path had no interest in how old I was or how hard I tried. It simply was. Eventually, I realized I hadn't heard my son's footsteps in a while. I rounded a bend and saw him waiting up ahead, arms crossed, looking slightly annoyed. "You all right?" he asked, not in words, but with the angle of his posture. I nodded and tapped the ground with the walking stick. He turned again and started down the trail faster. I followed. The light changed as the canopy thickened. The birds grew quieter. I looked up and saw a hawk circling high above the treetops. It moved in slow, wide spirals, as if tracing the shape of something I couldn't yet see. I envied it. The ease of flight. The lack of obligation. My ankle started to ache. I tried to hide the limp by shortening my stride. The stick helped, but the ground here was uneven, tangled with roots that rose like knuckles. Every few steps I had to steady myself. I told myself it was just for today, just until the loop brought us back to the car. Then I could rest. But the forest seemed to grow heavier around me, as if the air itself had weight. My legs grew tired, and I could no longer keep pace. Brian was just a figure now, shrinking between the trees. I called out, not loud, but enough to make him stop. He turned, a faint line of impatience on his face, then pointed down a path I hadn't noticed before. He said it led back, that it was shorter, that I could take it and he'd circle around to the car. I nodded. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like he knew the trail. I trusted him. I always had. He turned again, disappearing around a bend, his back straight and his strides confident. I stood for a moment at the edge of that narrow path, looking at the direction he'd pointed. Then I stepped into the shadowed corridor of trees, unaware that the forest was about to show me something I would never forget. The moment I stepped onto that side trail, something shifted beneath my feet. It wasn't just the texture of the path, though that changed too. The dirt was looser, darker, lined with tangled moss and patches of wet leaves that stuck to my boots like reminders. No, the shift was deeper than that. It was the stillness. The trees grew denser here, taller, their trunks thicker and closer together, as if they had huddled over the years to keep something in, or something out. The sunlight, which had filtered gently through the branches earlier, became threadbare. What little light remained hung above like a washed-out memory. And the silence. It was no longer just absence of sound. It felt intentional, like a pause between sentences that meant more than words ever could. I adjusted my grip on the walking stick and took another step forward. The ground dipped slightly, just enough to keep my knees guessing. With each footfall, the trail narrowed further, bordered now by tall ferns and thick brambles that clawed at the fabric of my jeans. I kept walking, even as a strange weight settled on my shoulders. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the awareness of being watched, though not by anything human. The forest didn't care who I was, but it noticed. It always noticed. I measured my progress not in distance, but in sounds. The first to vanish were the birds, then the insects. Then even the distant rustle of wind seemed to drop away, like it had lost interest. All that remained was the sound of my own breathing and the dull, rhythmic tap of my stick against the earth. That sound became a metronome, keeping time for thoughts I'd tried not to hear. I thought about the house, about the way the morning light used to fall through the kitchen blinds onto the ceramic tile, the way Ellen used to hum while drying dishes. That sound had faded long ago, replaced by the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of my own joints as I moved around alone. I thought about Brian's voice, always firm, always half a step ahead of empathy. I thought about how he didn't know me anymore, not really, and how I'd let that happen. Somewhere along the way, he stopped asking questions, and I stopped answering the ones he didn't ask. And now, here I was, following a path he'd suggested, unsure of whether I was supposed to trust the trail or question the man who pointed me toward it. The trail curved to the left, descending into a shallow gully lined with stones and tangled roots. I stepped carefully, but the slope pulled at me. I felt the sting of tension in my ankle, the tightness that came from overuse and stubbornness. I paused, not to rest, but to listen. Still no birds, no breeze, just the faint crackle of twigs beneath my boot. I took a breath and moved forward again, one step at a time. Each step echoed with memory. The time I sprained that same ankle coaching Little League, refusing to leave the dugout. The time I twisted it on the steps carrying groceries after Ellen's back surgery, too proud to ask for help. That ankle had always carried more than weight. It carried pride, mistakes, endurance. Now it carried silence. The brush thickened to my left, and I noticed the faint outline of what might have once been a deer path veering into the undergrowth. For a brief moment, I considered following it, wondering if it might lead back toward the creek or the road. But I didn't. I stuck to the path Brian had indicated, partly out of trust, partly out of habit. I had always followed the rules, the syllabus, the map. I believed in order, even when order no longer believed in me. The trail leveled out briefly, then dipped again, this time more sharply. The slope caught me off guard, and I had to brace myself against a nearby tree. My palm touched the rough bark, cool and slightly damp. I let it anchor me. There was a stillness in that tree, a permanence I envied. I stood there for a moment longer, not from pain, but from something more difficult to name. It was the feeling of being outside time. No classroom, no calendar, no responsibilities, just the woods and the slow passing of shadows across the ground. When I resumed walking, I noticed how my steps had changed. I was no longer walking with purpose. I was walking with awareness. Each placement of my foot was deliberate. I avoided stones, stepped over roots, leaned slightly into the stick to distribute my weight. The trail no longer felt like a loop. It felt like a question, and I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. I passed an old tree with a hollow near its base. Inside, the darkness was thick, almost velvety, and for a moment I imagined small eyes blinking back at me from within. But the hollow remained still, undisturbed. I moved on, though not without glancing back once. The image stayed with me, a small space carved by time, unbothered by the world beyond it, a hiding place, a grave, a refuge. I wasn't sure which. I began to lose track of time. My watch had stopped ticking months ago, and I never bothered to replace it. Now, minutes felt like hours, and steps felt like sentences in a book written by someone else. I wondered how far the trail would go. I wondered if it looped at all. I began to suspect it didn't. The ground beneath me changed again, softer, more uneven. Leaves piled thick over patches of mud. I slid twice but caught myself both times. My ankle throbbed. a low heat that reminded me I was still breakable. Then I saw it, a clearing up ahead, not wide, but open enough to let in a shaft of light that cut diagonally through the air like a blade. Dust particles floated in it, suspended like the pause between heartbeats. I stepped into the light and stood still. The warmth on my face startled me. It had been so long since I felt anything like that. In that moment, I thought about going back, about turning around and retracing my steps. But when I turned, the trail behind me had already disappeared. The path, once clear, was now hidden by shadows, overgrowth, confusion. I could no longer tell where I had entered or where I was meant to go. The forest, in its quiet way, had swallowed the root. I stood in the clearing, surrounded by trees whose names I didn't know, with a walking stick in one hand and an ankle that pulsed with every heartbeat. I was not lost. I was simply apart, separate from the life I had known, from the man I had been, from the expectations I had carried like textbooks. And in that separateness, something stirred. Not fear, not yet. Just the realization that I had stepped not just into the forest, but into something far more quiet, far more patient, and far more exacting. I took one more step, then another. The ground no longer felt solid. The trail had no direction, but I kept walking. Not because I knew where I was going, but because stopping meant accepting that I didn't belong anywhere else. I didn't fall suddenly. It wasn't the kind of collapse you see in movies, the sharp break, the scream, the instant drama. No. It was slower than that. It began with a misstep, one foot catching beneath a ridge of wet roots, the other trying to adjust and failing. The ground seemed to tilt without warning. My walking stick skidded sideways. For a moment I was suspended, caught between balance and gravity, as if time itself paused to let me choose. But there was no choice. My body moved before my mind could react. The earth came up to meet me in one long, heavy second. I felt the jolt through my ankle first, a sharp, twisting surge that radiated up my leg like fire. Then the impact hit my shoulder, my ribs, my palms scraping over stone and bark. Leaves scattered. The forest gave no reaction. I landed hard, breath knocked from my chest, the taste of moss and dirt in my mouth. The silence afterward was complete. I stayed there for a while, not moving, just lying flat on the cold ground, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The pain in my ankle bloomed slowly, like a bruise rising from within. It wasn't a simple ache. It was thick and deep, a hot coil wrapping around the joint, tightening every time I breathed. I didn't try to get up immediately. Part of me hoped the pain would dull if I waited long enough, but it didn't. It grew. When I did try to shift, my leg protested violently. I gritted my teeth and reached for the walking stick, but it had rolled a few feet away, resting against a fallen log. The distance between us felt absurd. I stared at it for a long time, as if willing it to come back, but nothing moved, nothing helped, and I realized, for the first time, that I was well and truly alone. The canopy above me swayed slightly, a ripple of wind brushing the tops of the trees. I could see slivers of sky through the green and gray. My hands were dirty. My shirt had torn at the elbow. My knee throbbed in time with my heart. I leaned up slowly, shifting my weight to the side, hissing through clenched teeth. I couldn't put any pressure on the ankle. It folded like wet paper beneath me. I bit down on a curse and stayed still. Time blurred. I don't know how long I sat like that, half propped against a tree, legs twisted uncomfortably, the weight of the fall settling deeper into my bones. The forest didn't care. Birds still didn't sing. The shadows lengthened as the day moved on, drawing long lines across the ground. I thought about crawling. I thought about yelling. But my voice felt useless in that vast silence. The trees wouldn't answer. No one would. Eventually, I pulled myself forward with my arms, dragging my body awkwardly toward the stick. Every shift was a negotiation between pain and will. My fingers dug into the dirt. My shoulder screamed from the strain. But I reached it. I pulled it toward me like a lifeline and hugged it to my chest for a moment, just to feel the solidity of something inanimate and dependable. With its help, I managed to sit up straighter, pressing my back against a tree trunk. The pressure soothed my spine slightly. I closed my eyes and listened, hoping for footsteps, voices, anything. But the woods had closed around me completely. I was not on a main trail. I was not near any landmark. I was just one man, hidden beneath the trees, hurting in a place where no one would think to look. My thoughts drifted to Brian. I imagined him continuing along the loop, unaware or maybe just unconcerned. I wanted to believe he'd come back, that he'd notice my absence, that something inside him would pull him toward worry. But deep down, there was a part of me, small but growing, that feared he wouldn't. Not because he was cruel, but because I had become too quiet in his life, too passive, too invisible. I stayed that way for hours. The shadows turned blue as the light faded. I tried to shift positions to relieve the pressure on my hip, but every movement sent a bolt of pain through my leg. My fingers began to tremble. I didn't know if it was fear, cold, or something else. Hunger crept in slowly, not as a pang, but as a strange hollowing, as if my stomach had resigned itself before I did. I remembered lessons I used to teach about the frontier, about men who survived in the wild, who built fires with nothing, who read the stars and hunted with sharpened stone. I remembered how boys in the back row used to roll their eyes. Now I couldn't light a match if my life depended on it. My phone was in my jacket, but there was no signal. I knew that before I checked. No bars, just an empty icon, mocking me. The forest grew darker. The air cooled. A dampness settled into the fabric of my clothes. I could feel the chill crawl across my skin like fingers. I thought about trying to build a shelter, but my body wouldn't cooperate. Every attempt to move sent fresh pain lancing up my side. So I sat still, propped against the trunk, hands wrapped around the stick, listening to a world that no longer included me. I wondered if this was how it ended, not with drama or spectacle, but with a quiet slipping away in a forgotten place. Not with screams or farewells, but with a slow erasure, unnoticed by the people who once needed you. I thought about Ellen. I thought about her hands, the way they used to brush crumbs off the table with care, as if even waste deserved dignity. I missed that kind of gentleness. It didn't exist here. As the darkness deepened, the forest came alive in other ways. I heard distant snaps, the low groan of trees shifting in the wind, the rustle of unseen animals moving through underbrush. I tried not to imagine eyes watching me, but it was hard not to. I was injured. I was still. And I was somewhere I didn't belong. Eventually, I gave up on trying to stay alert. I leaned my head back against the tree, allowing the weight of fatigue to settle in. My breath slowed. The pain became background noise. I focused on the sky, now barely visible through the canopy, and the faint promise of morning. Somewhere above those leaves, the sun waited to rise again. I just had to make it until then. But more than the pain, more than the cold, what pressed hardest against me was the silence. The kind of silence that didn't ask questions, didn't offer answers. Just a void, patient and vast. And in that silence, I waited. Not for rescue, not even for hope, but for something else. Something I couldn't yet name. Night came slowly, but I felt every inch of its approach. The light didn't vanish all at once. It retreated by degrees, slipping off the bark, the leaves, the curves of the ground, like a tide going out. What had once been shapes became shadows, and then outlines, and then nothing at all. I sat still, wedged against the trunk of a tree, the walking stick resting across my lap like a broken oar in a sea of darkness. My leg throbbed with dull, steady pulses. Each one reminded me of its presence, Each one reminded me I couldn't move. I'd never spent a full night outdoors alone. Not in this way. Not unprepared. Injured, without even the assurance of shelter. In my younger years, I used to camp with Brian when he was a boy. We had a cheap nylon tent and a small propane stove. There were sleeping bags, marshmallows, pocket knives we never used. Those nights had been filled with firelight and stories, the world reduced to the small circle of warmth between us. But this night was larger than any circle. It stretched beyond my sight, beyond my reach, beyond any warmth I could remember. The cold came in slowly, threading itself through the fabric of my clothes, curling into the creases of my elbows and neck. I tried to shift my position to protect my injured ankle, but it was like moving a stone that had long since fused to the ground. Pain came again, fierce and unrelenting, and I stopped moving. Breathing through it was the only option. My breath misted in front of me, though I couldn't see it. I only felt the moisture on my lips, the way it cooled and vanished in the same second. Time lost meaning. I had no way to track it, no stars visible through the canopy, no moonlight to guide my sense of space. Only blackness and the occasional brush of a breeze that stirred the leaves above, with sounds too close to whispers. I couldn't tell what was wind and what was something else. There was no rhythm to the noise, just the random creaks and snaps and distant rustlings that told me I was not as alone as I felt. At one point, something moved nearby, close enough that I stopped breathing altogether. A crunch of leaves, a low, dragging sound. It could have been a raccoon, or a deer, or something else entirely. I didn't turn my head. I didn't move a muscle. I simply closed my eyes, as if the act of not seeing would make me invisible. I counted slowly in my head, not to track time, but to give myself something to do. That wasn't thinking. My heart pounded, each beat too loud in the silence. When the sound finally passed, I opened my eyes again. But there was no comfort in returning to the same darkness. My mind wandered then, not to the fear of animals or the pain in my leg, but to memory. That was the strange thing about nights like this, how the mind chooses what to hold. I thought of Ellen. I saw her hands, thin and capable, sorting laundry into neat piles by the fireplace. I remembered the shape of her neck when she bent forward to read, the way her feet never quite touched the floor when she sat in the armchair across from mine. I thought of the last words she said to me before the surgery that took her. They weren't dramatic, just a gentle instruction about where she had left the extra light bulbs, but that voice lived in me, even now. It wasn't loud, but it was solid. It anchored me in ways no tree ever could. I held on to it that night. I repeated it in my mind, that quiet phrase about the light bulbs, as if it were scripture, as if it could keep the dark from swallowing me completely. I wondered what Brian was doing, whether he had made it back to the car, whether he noticed my absence, whether he was still walking or already driving away. I didn't know which thought hurt more, that he had left me behind by accident, or that he had done it on purpose. Both possibilities sat heavily in my chest. I didn't want to believe he was capable of abandoning me, but the silence stretched on, hour after hour, and belief began to loosen its grip. The pain dulled eventually, not because it went away, but because my body grew numb from the cold. My fingers tingled, my jaw ached from clenching. Every few minutes I would shift slightly, just to remind myself that I could. I didn't want to fall asleep. I didn't trust what would happen if I did. Not just the fear of animals or hypothermia, but something else, something more final. Sleep felt like surrender, and I hadn't surrendered yet, but exhaustion was clever. It didn't demand. It seduced. It whispered things I wanted to believe, that the pain wasn't so bad, that maybe I would be found by morning, that maybe this was all a strange mistake that would be explained later, over coffee and apologies. I closed my eyes for longer stretches. I didn't dream. There was no space for dreams in that forest. Only waiting. I opened my eyes again when a drop of water hit my cheek. I hadn't realized it was raining. The canopy caught most of it, but small drops made their way through, cold and precise. The rain didn't last long, just enough to soak the shoulders of my shirt and trickle down the collar. I tilted my head back and let it wash my face. It felt like something alive, something that hadn't forgotten me. Somewhere far off, I heard a distant sound, like a low groan or a sigh from the earth itself. It passed quickly, and I wasn't sure if it was real or the product of a mind straining against isolation. My hearing had grown too sharp, tuned to every creak and shift. I imagined the forest breathing around me, ancient and slow, unconcerned with the fate of one man. I counted my breaths. I tried to stay awake. I watched the dark for any sign of change, and all the while I listened to the trees, to the pain, to the silence that wrapped around me like a blanket made of stone. The night did not answer. It simply endured. I waited with it. I endured with it. And somewhere between breath and memory, between pain and resignation, I passed into the next hour. Maybe it was midnight. Maybe it was closer to dawn. I didn't know. All I knew was that I was still there, still breathing, still not gone. And that, for the moment, would have to be enough. The forest didn't change, but something inside me did. Maybe it was the way the cold settled deeper into my chest, or the realization that morning was still hours away. Maybe it was the numbness in my legs, or the ache in my back that forced me inward. I don't know what opened the door, but once it cracked, the memories came in like wind through a broken window. I didn't invite them. They simply arrived. I remembered the house we lived in when Brian was born. A 2-bedroom in a quiet corner of Springfield with uneven floorboards and a porch that leaned slightly to the left. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon more often than not, because Ellen loved baking things she didn't always finish. She used to hum along to the radio as she moved from counter to oven, wiping her hands on the same towel she kept slung over her shoulder. The linoleum was cracked near the sink, and every winter the pipes groaned like old men in the cold. But it was ours. Every inch of it felt like a room I had built with my bare hands, even if I never actually lifted a hammer. I remembered the first time Brian rode a bike without training wheels. He was 7. The street sloped slightly, and I had warned him not to go too fast. He didn't listen, of course. He pushed hard and flew straight into a rose bush 2 houses down. He came up scratched and embarrassed, but I pretended not to laugh. I just lifted him out, brushed off the leaves, and checked his elbows. That's what you did when you were a father. You showed up when it mattered. You made the pain smaller by being there. I remembered how he held my hand the rest of the walk home without saying a word. My breath fogged in the dark, but I didn't feel it anymore. My body had become a kind of shell. The forest faded around me, and I drifted deeper into the places only memory could reach. I saw Ellen's face again, young, tired, beautiful, in the way only familiarity can make someone. I saw her on the day we moved into our second house, boxes stacked higher than the energy we had. I saw her fall asleep on the couch with her hand still holding a spoon from dinner, a streak of sauce on her cheek. I never told her. I liked that moment too much to erase it. I remembered the smell of fresh paint in Brian's room when he was 11. We had promised to redecorate it together, but he got bored halfway through. I finished the job after he fell asleep, sitting on the floor with a roller and a lamp, covering the walls in blue while the rest of the house slept. The next morning, he looked surprised. Not grateful, just surprised. That's how it was with children. They think things appear on their own until they're old enough to see the effort behind it. I remembered the day my father died. I was 32. Brian was still small. We got the call after dinner. Ellen took the phone. She didn't say anything until she hung up. She just came into the living room, sat down beside me, and took my hand. That's all she did. And it was enough. I hadn't spoken to my father in years. We weren't close. He was a hard man, full of silence and expectations. But grief has a strange way of finding cracks in your armor. I sat in the dark that night and thought of all the times he didn't show up. I promised myself I would never be that kind of father. But promises have a way of fading in the noise of living. I tried. I really did. I made lunches, drove to school events, worked extra hours so Brian could have braces and summer camp and a used car on his 16th birthday. I stayed up late reviewing college applications with him. I sat quietly in the back row at his graduation, letting his mother take the front. I cheered anyway. I clapped even when my hands ached. I remembered the argument we had when he told us he was moving across the country. He said it like he was announcing the weather, like it was just something that had to happen. Ellen cried. I didn't. I couldn't. Not then. I just helped him pack and paid for the truck rental. When he hugged me goodbye, it was the kind of hug men give each other when they're already somewhere else in their minds. I stood in the driveway after he left, holding a coffee mug I didn't realize I had brought outside, and stared at the spot where his car had been. I didn't go back inside for a long time. The forest seemed quieter the more I remembered. Not peaceful, just still, as if it was listening, as if it had waited years to hear what I had kept locked inside. I remembered Ellen's last birthday. She didn't want a party. She just wanted to sit on the back porch and watch the wind move through the trees. I made her a cup of tea and brought out the old blanket we used when we first got married. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. She just looked out across the yard and smiled. That smile stayed with me longer than anything else. It stayed long after the doctors, long after the hospital visits, long after the funeral home closed its doors behind me. I remembered the day I gave Brian the deed to the house. He was struggling, newly married, trying to make ends meet. I thought I was helping. I thought it would bring us closer. I signed it over with the belief that he'd understand what it meant, not just legally, but emotionally. He took the papers, said thank you, and moved in with the confidence of someone who had never paid for the floor under his feet. I didn't blame him. Not exactly. I just waited for the day he'd see it. Really see it. The quiet giving behind it all. I shifted again. My ankle throbbed with the movement. The forest remained indifferent. Above me, branches moved gently in the wind, casting shadows I couldn't see but could imagine. I remembered the sound of Brian's laughter when he was 4, unfiltered, bright, like bells in a church I no longer attended. I remembered the way he used to run into my arms without thinking, without shame. That kind of love doesn't last, not because it disappears, but because it grows up, and sometimes it forgets where it started. I remembered myself at 45, standing in the backyard after mowing the lawn, looking up at the sky and wondering how I got there. I remembered myself at 53, holding Ellen's hand during her first chemotherapy treatment, pretending to be strong while she was the one reassuring me. I remembered being 67, folding laundry alone for the first time in decades, realizing I had forgotten how to separate the colors. I remembered last Thanksgiving, sitting at the far end of a table I used to host, watching Brian carve a turkey in a house that used to be mine, listening to a conversation I was no longer part of. I remembered everything, and as the memories drifted through me like smoke, the pain in my leg, the cold in my bones, the fear in my chest, all of it softened. Not disappeared, but softened. The weight of what had been carried me through what was, and in that quiet, painful place beneath the trees, I understood something I hadn't before. I wasn't waiting to be rescued. I was remembering how much I had already survived. At some point during the night, I lost track of where my body ended and where the forest began. The line blurred. not in a poetic sense, but in a real physical way. My limbs were cold and stiff, my hands caked with dirt, my face rough with dried leaves and dust. The tree behind me pressed into my spine like a second skeleton, holding me upright when my own bones failed to do so. I no longer tried to count the hours. Time didn't exist out there, not in a way I understood. It moved like the wind, visible only in what it left behind. My breath had become shallow. Each inhale tasted of damp moss and rot, of the slow decomposition that fed the roots beneath me. The earth was alive in ways I hadn't understood before. It breathed differently. It pulsed in cycles that didn't care for human rhythm. And as I sat there, broken, half-frozen, nearly silent, I felt something ancient passing through the soil and into me. My hand rested on a patch of ground where the leaves had thinned. Beneath them, the soil was soft but dense, cool to the touch. I pressed my fingers into it slowly, feeling it resist, and then give way, the same way a memory did when it hadn't been visited in years. My fingertips brushed against a small root, thin, stubborn, curled like a knuckle. It didn't snap when I touched it. It bent, flexed, and returned to its place. That movement stayed with me longer than I expected. There was something comforting in it, that silent resilience, that refusal to break. The root didn't demand to be seen. It didn't cry out. It simply held the earth in place, unseen by those who walked above. Like so many things I had done in my life. I pressed my palm flat against the dirt. The texture shifted beneath my skin. Grit, moisture, fragments of things long decayed. I imagined the layers beneath. Insects tunneling in patterns that mimicked logic. Stones worn smooth by centuries. Seeds waiting for spring. There were stories in that soil. Not written in ink, not spoken aloud, but carved in the quiet persistence of things that survived by staying still. The forest had its own language, not made of words, but of arrangements. The way one leaf landed atop another. The angle of a fallen branch pointing toward the past. The concentric rings of fungi on a damp log, like the ripples of time etched into flesh. I began to read them, not as a scholar, but as someone who had run out of other things to do. Each sign felt like a whisper, not for the ears, but for the skin. Near my foot, my good foot, grew a patch of small, stubborn ferns. Their leaves curled at the edges like they had something to say, and weren't sure how. I reached toward them, not to pick or disturb, but to feel their texture. The fronds recoiled slightly at first, then relaxed. I envied their instinct. I had spent years softening myself for the comfort of others, removing the thorns, silencing the warning bells, making myself easier to love. The ferns knew better. The ache in my ankle pulsed again, sharp and mean. I let it happen. There was no point resisting pain in a place like this. It had become part of the atmosphere, like the fog or the cold. My mind wandered again, but not to the past this time. It stayed with the earth, with the symbols around me. I looked down at the patterns the leaves had formed. Some had landed perfectly still, edges touching like puzzle pieces. Others overlapped haphazardly, as if arguing for space. I saw one leaf, pale and brittle, resting atop a small stone. Its stem had cracked, but it still clung. A single bead of dew shimmered on its surface, catching a hint of light that filtered through the branches above. That drop became a symbol in itself, fragile, temporary, beautiful, only because it wouldn't last. There was a flat rock to my right, half buried and moss-covered. I studied it the way I used to study the faces of my students, looking for clues, for signs of understanding or resistance. The rock had no expression, but its presence was certain, solid, unmoved. I imagined placing my hand on it and letting it absorb some part of my fear, but I didn't. It was enough to know it was there. I wondered how many things I had passed over in my life, objects, places, people, without realizing their quiet significance. How many times had I walked across soil that remembered things I never would? How many hours had I spent chasing clarity when meaning was already underfoot? The forest didn't speak, but it offered. In its way, it showed me what endurance looked like when it had no witnesses. A tree growing around a metal fence, a root splitting a boulder over decades, a patch of lichen carving green into gray. These were not acts of defiance. They were declarations of presence. I had spent my whole life trying to matter in ways that were visible. Grades, promotions, accolades, property. But in the end, the earth whispered a different truth. What lasts does not need to be seen. A sudden breeze passed through the branches, and a cluster of leaves fell around me like muted confetti. One landed on my shoulder. I let it rest there, not brushing it off. It felt like acknowledgement, not salvation, not solution. Just a nod from something older than me, saying, "I see you here." I closed my eyes again, not to sleep, but to listen better, to feel the patterns in the cold, in the silence, in the ache. My breath slowed. I imagined my body as part of the ground, my back the bark, my fingers roots, my thoughts compost for whatever came next. And in that stillness, I finally understood something that had always escaped me. I didn't need to rise to matter. I didn't need to speak to be heard. I didn't need to move to leave a trace. The earth beneath me had already begun the slow work of remembering. And that would be enough. Morning didn't arrive with fanfare. It seeped in slowly, like water through cloth, without warmth or ceremony. The first sign wasn't light. It was sound. A distant chirp, tentative and brief, followed by silence. Then another. Birds returning to their routines, unaware of the man curled into the roots of a tree with a leg that refused to hold him, and a body that had grown too used to stillness. I opened my eyes not because I was ready, but because my body wouldn't let me pretend anymore. The cold had settled deep into my joints during the night. It wasn't the kind of cold you shake off with movement or breath. It had become part of me, layered into muscle, woven into bone. My fingers wouldn't close properly. My legs had gone numb in strange places. The pain in my ankle, once a sharp flash, had dulled into something slower and heavier, like a weight rather than a wound. I couldn't tell if that was better or worse. I tried to stretch, to shift slightly, but my spine groaned at the attempt. The bark of the tree had left impressions along my back, grooves I could feel even through the thick flannel of my shirt. My shoulder, the one I had leaned against for hours, had become stiff and swollen. Every part of me had taken on the shape of the night. I was no longer just injured. I was changed. The forest had transformed too. What had been shadow and threat during the night was now a landscape washed in pale, cold light. The trees looked different, less imposing, more indifferent. The canopy had thinned in places, allowing slices of dawn to filter through, but the light held no heat. It painted the world in gray and silver, as if even the sun had been chilled by the night. I looked at my hands, dirt embedded under the nails, small cuts along the knuckles, skin dry and pale. I flexed them slowly, coaxing life back into the fingers. They trembled with the effort. I pressed one palm into the soil beside me and tried to push myself upright. The motion was clumsy. My body resisted like rusted metal. My ankle flared in protest, and I froze halfway up, waiting for the pain to settle into something bearable. When it did, I managed to shift into a sitting position with my back no longer touching the tree. It felt like progress, even if it hurt. I pulled the walking stick toward me. Its surface was slick with morning dew, but I gripped it anyway. I needed the illusion of readiness, even if I couldn't move more than a few inches. I rested my chin against the top of the stick and scanned the clearing. There was no sign of Brian, no path carved in the leaves, no familiar shape among the trunks, just the trees and their quiet disregard. I listened again. The birds had grown bolder. Their calls were more frequent, but still distant. I heard something scurry through the underbrush to my left. A squirrel or chipmunk, maybe. Something small and free. A breeze moved through the trees, gentle but sharp. It lifted a layer of dampness from my clothes, making me shiver. My mouth was dry, my throat lined with the kind of roughness that came from breathing cold air too long. I licked my lips and tasted nothing. Hunger gnawed faintly at my stomach, but thirst was louder. I thought about water, clean and cold, the kind that ran from a tap without effort. I remembered the sound it made filling a glass, the way it felt going down. Out here, those things belonged to another life. I tilted my head back and looked up. Through the gaps in the branches, the sky was a dull, heavy blue, clouded, without definition. A sky that hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. I wondered how long it would stay that way, whether the day would bring sun or more cold, whether the silence would lift. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to gather. I thought of all the mornings I had taken for granted. Warm beds, the smell of coffee drifting through the kitchen, the soft shuffle of Ellen's slippers on hardwood, the rattle of the newspaper landing outside the door, Brian's footsteps on the stairs when he was still young enough to need permission. Those mornings were gone. This one had no coffee, no sound but the birds, no comfort but the tree behind me. When I opened my eyes again, a crow landed on a branch not far away. It cocked its head and looked at me, curious but unbothered. Its feathers gleamed in the muted light. It made no sound, just watched. I met its gaze, and for a moment we regarded each other like strangers who had chosen the same bench. Then it lifted off, wings spreading wide, and disappeared into the branches. I watched it go until I couldn't anymore. I felt the first flicker of emotion rise in my chest. Not fear, not despair, but something older, something closer to defiance. I wasn't dead. I wasn't finished. I had made it through the night. My body ached and faltered, but I was still here, still breathing, still aware. The forest hadn't taken me. The cold hadn't erased me. The silence hadn't swallowed me. I began to think, not of rescue, but of what came next. I knew I couldn't walk. Not far, but maybe far enough. Maybe to a place where the trees thinned, where a road might hum in the distance, where someone, anyone, might notice a shape moving slowly through the brush. It was a thin hope, but it was mine. I looked around for anything I might use. Fallen branches, signs of direction, even broken patterns in the leaves that might lead me back to the main trail. I didn't find much, but I marked the direction the light seemed strongest and committed it to memory. The pain in my ankle would make it impossible to stand fully, but I had arms. I had a stick. I had the knowledge that I had survived worse in other ways. I didn't try to move just yet. I let the morning settle into me. I let the cold become something I wore, not something I feared. I leaned forward slightly, testing how much weight I could bear. It wasn't much, but it was something. I pressed the stick into the soil and watched it hold. A small thing, but it was enough to start. And as I sat there, legs twisted beneath me, back sore, hands shaking, I realized that this morning, cold as it was, carried one simple truth. I was still mine. Not the forest's, not the pains, not the past's, mine. That truth would be what I carried next. I heard it before I understood it. It cut through the forest like a sharp edge through paper, sudden and unnatural, cracking across the silence with a force that felt personal. A scream. Long, panicked, unmistakably human. Not an animal's cry or the groan of trees under wind. This was something torn from a throat. And it didn't come from me. I froze, not because I was afraid, but because every cell in my body paused to listen. The scream came again, shorter this time, hoarse, fractured. It echoed through the trees, bounced off trunks, and scattered through branches. It came from the direction I had last seen Brian disappear. My grip tightened around the walking stick, my knuckles whitening, not from cold, but from the tremor that surged through me. There was something final in that sound, something that didn't ask for help, but bled it. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, that my mind, stretched thin by pain and cold, had conjured the sound out of desperation or delusion. But the forest reacted. Birds burst into motion overhead. Leaves shook violently where no wind had touched them. Something had shifted in the ecosystem around me, and I felt it like a pulse beneath the soil. Then the forest returned to silence, but not the silence I'd known through the night. This was different. This was a silence that leaned forward, a silence with breath held tight in its chest. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from recognition. There are sounds that only mean one thing, and this one had no ambiguity. It was the sound of someone confronting something they couldn't explain, the kind of scream that comes not from injury, but from realization. I didn't call out, not yet. I didn't trust my voice. I didn't trust what might answer back. I stayed still and listened. A branch snapped, not far. Then another. Not the slow creaking of a falling limb, but the quick, panicked crack of feet stumbling through the brush. Heavy footsteps, clumsy, unsure of where they were headed. They came closer, then paused. Breathing. I could hear it, ragged and loud, heavier than mine, frantic. Then silence again. I leaned my head slowly toward the sound, straining my ears. I thought I caught the edge of a whisper, or maybe it was just the blood in my ears. I adjusted my posture slightly, trying to prop myself higher against the tree trunk. Pain radiated through my side. My ankle throbbed with renewed anger. But I didn't stop. The air felt tighter now. The cold that had consumed the night began to retreat under the pale light of morning, but in its place came something stranger. The forest itself felt awake, not in the gentle breathing way of nature resuming its rhythm, but in the way a house does when someone slams a door in another room, and no one else is supposed to be home. I heard the scream again, but this time, not in real time, in my head. My mind replayed it, over and over, examining the edges of it like a broken plate you turn in your hands to understand the fault line. There had been recognition in it, not just fear, not surprise, something deeper, something closer to shame. I remembered how Brian used to scream when he was small, always over little things, a scraped knee, a broken toy, the time he thought he lost his favorite stuffed animal but had just kicked it under the bed. His voice had always been high and clear back then. But people forget what their own voices sound like when they're vulnerable. They forget the pitch, the rawness. I recognized that voice now. I didn't think. I didn't reason. My hand rose from my lap and clenched around the walking stick. I tried to push myself up, to force weight onto the injured ankle. It folded instantly, and I crumpled back down. The bark bit into my back. I ground my teeth, pushed again, this time using only my good leg and my arms. My entire frame shook. My vision blurred for a moment, but I managed to rise into a half-kneel, leaning hard on the stick. Another crack of movement in the woods. I turned toward it and stayed there, waiting, listening. The footsteps resumed, slower now, deliberate but hesitant. And then, through the thin branches between the trees, I saw him. He stepped into view like a man stepping into a memory, pale, mouth half open, eyes wide with something I hadn't seen in him in years, uncertainty. His clothes were torn at the sleeve. Mud caked one pant leg. He stumbled slightly, caught himself on a branch, then looked up. Our eyes met. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I watched as something moved through his expression. Recognition, disbelief, maybe even guilt. He looked older than he had the day before. Thinner, smaller. Whatever he had seen in the woods had left its mark. Whatever he had screamed at, it had found a place in his body and stayed there. But I still didn't say anything. The moment stretched between us, brittle and full of things unsaid. He took a step toward me, then stopped. He opened his mouth, closed it again. His breathing had slowed, but not calmed. He looked at me like a man seeing someone he thought he had lost, or maybe someone he thought he had left behind. Either way, he didn't look triumphant. He looked undone. I watched the shape of him, the man who used to sit on my shoulders, the man who once called for me when nightmares found him. Now he was the one haunted, and the forest had been the one to show him what I never could. Not through lectures, not through discipline, but through silence. I didn't need to ask what he saw. It didn't matter, because whatever had been screaming inside him now had a name. And it wasn't the forest. It wasn't some shadow in the trees. It was something he carried, something that had followed him longer than he realized. And now, standing there, with me watching and not speaking, he had to face it. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't offer punishment. I simply remained, upright, injured, present. Sometimes the greatest scream is the one no one answers. Sometimes silence is the echo that lingers long after the cry. He stood a few yards away, unmoving, his chest heaving like a man who had just surfaced from deep water. His shoulders, once so squared and confident, slouched forward under an invisible weight. He looked as if he had seen something that tore the foundation from under his feet, and he hadn't yet figured out how to stand on what remained. But what caught me most wasn't his posture, or his bruised clothes. It was his face. I had seen every version of that face. As a newborn, soft and crumpled. As a child, full of energy and endless questions. As a teenager, hardened by pride, slick with defiance. As a man, unreadable and distant. But the face he wore now was one I didn't recognize. And yet, it was the most honest I had ever seen. He was pale in the light of morning, the grayish kind of pale that seemed to come from inside rather than from the cold. His jaw twitched with some internal conflict he couldn't control. His lips parted and closed again, like a man struggling to speak through winded breath, but no sound came. There was a tremor in his hands, too slight to be dramatic, too steady to be missed. He didn't try to hide it. Maybe he no longer could. His eyes didn't meet mine at first. They moved, searching the trees, the sky, the ground around my feet, anywhere but directly at me. It reminded me of how children look after they've broken something fragile. Not out of guilt, not at first. Out of fear. Fear of consequence. Fear of being found out. Fear of understanding too late what they've done. But he wasn't a child. And this wasn't a broken plate or a cracked window. This was something deeper. He had broken something that had always been invisible, something that lived between us. When his eyes finally did reach mine, I saw it. Raw and unguarded. Fear. Not fear of me. Not fear of punishment. Not even fear of what the forest might hold. It was the fear that comes when a man realizes he has been wrong, not in theory, but in action. When he can't hide behind excuses or context. When he knows he made a decision, and that decision has consequences he can no longer outrun. It was the fear of recognition. He saw me, not just as a figure slumped against a tree, not just as the father he had once tried to protect or ignore or care for on his own terms. He saw the full weight of what it meant to leave someone behind, to walk away, to believe, even for a moment, that they wouldn't matter in the end. And worse, he saw himself, reflected in that silence, reflected in the shape I had become. I didn't move. My breath was shallow from the cold. My leg pulsed with dull pain, but I sat straight. I kept my eyes on him. I gave him nothing to hide behind. He stepped forward, just 1 foot. The sound of the leaf crunch beneath his boot seemed louder than it should have been. He flinched at the noise, as if it reminded him that he wasn't a ghost yet, that he still had a body, that he still occupied space, that he was still responsible. He rubbed a hand across his face, trying to erase something invisible. Maybe the fear, maybe the shame, maybe the image of me, still breathing when I shouldn't have been. I had survived, and something in him had not expected that. There are moments when fear rewrites a person. You can see it happen, a shifting in the skin, a collapse of whatever mask they wore. I watched as his expression changed, not softened, not relaxed, but crumbled slightly, as if what held his image together had given out. There were no words in him, none he could form without them breaking apart in his throat. He didn't need them. His silence spoke louder than anything else. In it, I heard his panic. I heard the long night he must have spent alone in the woods, unsure of his way, unsure of mine. I heard the moment he realized I hadn't returned, the moment he understood he might be the reason why. And I heard, most of all, the thing he could not say, that some part of him had not planned to return at all. That was the face he wore now, a man who had stared into the consequence of his own choices and found no one else to blame. I didn't give him anything, no reassurance, no anger, no accusation, just stillness. The morning wind shifted, pushing the leaves around us into soft motion. The forest had no interest in our standoff. It had witnessed far older dramas than this. It simply moved forward. He took another step, slower this time, like approaching a wounded animal or a grave. His body was rigid with caution, not because I was dangerous, but because he knew he couldn't undo what had already happened. Some things, once lived, don't unlive. He opened his mouth again, closed it, looked down. I saw it then, his shadow, long and narrow, cast across the clearing, reaching toward me but never quite touching. That too felt like a symbol, an extension of someone who could no longer step fully into the space he had left behind. I didn't want anything from him. No apology would fix what had passed between us. No gesture could erase the silence of the night, the cold that had wrapped around my ribs like vines, the ache of waiting without hope. But I also didn't want revenge. I had no use for punishment. I didn't need him to suffer. What I needed was for him to see me, not as a burden, not as an obligation, but as the man who had carried him before he could walk, who had stood behind him when no one else did, who had stayed even when his own heart broke under the weight of loneliness. And now, he had seen. The face of fear isn't always about terror. Sometimes it's about truth, about being unprepared for it, about realizing, in one frozen moment, that all the stories you told yourself no longer work. I watched as that realization settled into him, heavier than any pack he might have carried. I saw the lines around his eyes deepen, the shape of his mouth lose its defensiveness. He looked older now, not just from fatigue, but from finally knowing. I remained still, and in that stillness I offered nothing but a mirror. What he did next was no longer mine to influence. I had given enough. The rest was his. He didn't speak, and neither did I. The air between us thickened, not with anger or blame, but with the heavy quiet of everything we didn't say. I had learned long ago that silence could carry more than words. It could bear weight, memory, disappointment, and truth, all without a sound. And now, in that clearing surrounded by indifferent trees, silence was the only language we had left. I watched him closely, not to intimidate, not to test, but to witness. There is something sacred in witnessing a man in the moment he is undone. He stood there, still as stone, unsure how to cross the distance between us, unsure how to reshape what had already broken. But I wasn't there to guide him. I had done enough guiding. This was the part he had to do on his own. The look in his eyes changed slowly. The fear didn't disappear, but it shifted into something more complicated. He looked like a man who had just discovered the floor beneath his feet wasn't solid, and now he was trying to stand still on sinking ground. His lips moved once, but no sound came. I didn't offer him an easier way. I didn't fill the silence. I let him live in it, just as I had, all night. I didn't move, my back still pressed against the tree. My leg pulsed in dull protest, the ankle swollen, my hands trembling with cold and fatigue. I was stiff, tired, older than I had ever felt, but I didn't let it show. My stillness was not weakness. It was intention. I wanted him to understand what I had become in his absence, not out of punishment, but out of necessity. Still, he hovered at the edge, waiting for something, some sign, some word, some permission to undo what had been done. But I had none to give. Silence had become my only currency, and I wasn't about to spend it cheaply. His eyes dropped to the ground. He shifted his weight. The crunch of leaves beneath his boots echoed through the trees. He reached up and rubbed his neck, a gesture I remembered from when he was younger, something he did when he was trying to push down emotion, a self-soothing tic he probably didn't even realize he still had. That alone told me more than 1,000 words could have. I let the quiet stretch. It didn't threaten me. I had lived inside it for longer than he could understand. After Ellen died, I had learned to sit in rooms where the only sound was my own breathing. I had cooked meals in silence, eaten them in silence, washed the dishes without the sound of laughter or footsteps or conversation. I had listened to the hum of the refrigerator like it was a lullaby. Silence had stopped being a void. It had become a companion. Now it stood between us like a third presence, tall, invisible, undeniable. He stepped forward finally. Just one step. He wasn't ready for more. I saw his fingers twitch slightly, as if tempted to reach out, to make physical contact, to offer something tangible. But he didn't. Instead, he let his hands fall back to his sides, clenched lightly, as if even that movement hurt. There was a kind of reverence in his stance now, though I doubt he knew it. He looked at me the way a man looks at a headstone, not for answers, but for understanding, for peace, and perhaps for forgiveness. But I wasn't there to grant forgiveness. That's not how it works. Forgiveness isn't a gift you hand over. It's a space you create. And that space had not yet formed. So I gave him nothing, not cruelty, not comfort, just the honesty of presence. The forest seemed to understand. A breeze moved through the branches above, shaking loose a handful of leaves. They fell between us, drifting slowly like ash. One landed on my thigh. I left it there. His face broke then, not into tears, not into a sob, but into something quieter and deeper. His eyes reddened slightly. His jaw slackened. His breath caught. The scaffolding of his pride had cracked. He was no longer trying to hold it together. He was simply standing there, raw and unsure. I had waited years to see that version of him. And yet, now that I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt stillness. There's a kind of balance that happens in moments like that, when one person holds silence not as a shield, but as a mirror. He saw himself in me now, not in my body, not in my words, but in what I had endured, and he didn't know what to do with that. The silence between us became an offering. It said, "I won't chase you. I won't save you. I won't condemn you. But I am here." That, I knew, would echo in him longer than any sermon. It would follow him through the rest of his life, in rooms filled with voices, in celebrations where laughter rang loud. He would remember the absence, the stillness, the man who did not speak because there was nothing left to say. I had given him everything already: my time, my labor, my body, my trust, my past, all of it. And when he had walked away, I had not stopped him. I had let him go with the last thing I had left, my belief that he would return different. Now, he had. But I had changed too. The part of me that used to fill the room, that used to reach out first, that used to forgive before the wound had even cooled. That part was gone. Not in bitterness, not in vengeance, but in clarity. He had arrived looking for words, looking for rescue, looking for a familiar script where we would fall back into our roles. Me, the father, him, the son, and the pain swept away like dust from a kitchen floor. But I offered him silence, and in that silence, I gave him the only thing I had left, a reflection. It was up to him now to see what was there, to carry it, to decide what to do with it. And I knew, whether he stayed another second or walked away again, he would never hear silence the same way again. The forest had been there the whole time, watching, not like a person watches with curiosity or judgment, but with something more permanent, something elemental. It had stood silent through our unraveling, through the scream, through the collapse of everything my son and I had built and broken. It had watched us with the patience of stone, with the stillness of things that existed long before us and would remain long after. I sat under that same tree, my spine aching against its rough bark, my limbs stiff and slow. My breath left me in slow, deliberate clouds. The pain in my ankle had dulled into something cold and constant, like an old truth you learn to live with. I could feel the forest breathing around me, not in any literal way, but in the creak of the branches, the way the light shifted across the ground, the soft hush of the leaves adjusting themselves. The forest didn't speak, but it bore witness. It had seen the moment I fell. It had heard the weight of my body hit the earth and listened as I gasped through the first wave of pain. It had felt the change in the air when I realized I had been left, and it had remained indifferent, but not unaware. There was something strangely comforting in that indifference. Unlike people, the forest didn't pretend. It didn't apologize. It didn't offer words it didn't mean. It simply existed, whole and unashamed, unburdened by the weight of interpretation. It gave me no meaning, no answers, but it gave me presence. And in that presence, I found a kind of dignity. I looked around at the tall trunks rising like pillars, their bark rough and scarred from storms and time. Some were twisted slightly, bent by wind or lightning, but still they stood. Some leaned toward others, touched only by a limb or a shadow. None of them perfect, none of them symmetrical, but all of them alive. And it struck me, this forest, with all its brokenness, had more integrity than most people I knew. There were no straight lines here, no clean borders, no neat resolutions. And maybe that was why it had held me. Not because it wanted me, not because it cared, but because it understood how to hold broken things. It had been holding them for centuries, fallen branches, rotting stumps, nests abandoned mid-season. It made room for loss and let it become part of the pattern. That was a kind of wisdom I had never been taught in school. Brian remained nearby, quiet now, more shadow than man. He hadn't tried to close the distance again. He stood with his hands at his sides, his eyes still locked somewhere between past and present. I didn't look at him anymore, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to. The forest was watching enough for the both of us. A small bird landed a few feet away, hopping through the fallen leaves with casual confidence. It pecked at something invisible, then moved on, uninterested in the human tension nearby. I envied its freedom, its certainty, its lack of questions. To exist only in the moment, that was a luxury we were no longer afforded. I let my head rest back against the tree. The bark dug into my scalp, rough and uneven. It reminded me I was still part of something, still connected to the real. I had spent too many years drifting through a world of muted conversation and empty gestures. Too many holidays where the table was full, but the silence between bites screamed louder than joy. Too many moments where my presence was treated like furniture, useful, unmoving, expected. But here, in the dirt and the damp, I was no one's convenience. I was simply a man, worn, weathered, waiting. And the forest didn't ask me to be anything else. A breeze moved through the clearing, lifting the topsoil into a brief dance before settling again. I felt it on my cheeks, against the back of my neck, like a whisper with no intention. The light shifted again, less gray now, more silver. The sun had started its climb, but the warmth hadn't arrived yet. That felt appropriate. The light without the warmth, truth without the comfort. I began to notice how much life surrounded me in its quiet way. Insects moving beneath the surface, a spider web strung between two low branches, glistening with dew. Tiny holes in the ground that hinted at burrowing creatures. Nothing here cared about my presence, but all of it acknowledged it. I was simply one more figure in the cycle, no more important than the fallen leaf, no less. There was a strange relief in that, in knowing that the universe didn't hinge on my pain, that I could suffer without disrupting anything, that I could fall apart without dragging the world down with me. I had spent too much of my life believing I had to hold everything together. The father, the husband, the rock. But rocks crack, and fathers grow old, and husbands outlive the people they loved. And still, the forest stands. I looked up into the canopy again. The leaves high above moved like thoughts I couldn't reach. They rustled without urgency, without agenda. They simply responded to the wind as it passed. No resistance, no control, only response. Brian made a small movement behind me, a shuffle of feet, a breath held and released. I heard it, but I didn't react. I didn't need to. He was learning something in that moment, whether he understood it or not. He was standing in a cathedral that didn't require kneeling, and for once he was quiet enough to hear what it didn't say. The forest would not forget this, not in a mystical way, not in the way stories are told, but in the way the soil holds footprints, even after the walker is gone, in the way a tree grows slightly differently after it's been leaned on, in the way birds avoid a place where something once cried out. The memory would stay, not as a scar, but as a shift in the pattern, subtle, lasting. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I let the forest witness me, not as a father, not as a victim, not even as a man left behind, just as something alive, still here, still waiting. When he finally moved toward me, the forest didn't react. The branches didn't creak. The wind didn't shift. No great sound marked the moment. It was not a reunion. It was not a resolution. It was simply motion, slow, hesitant, and entirely necessary. One foot, then the next, pressing into the softened earth, breaking through a crust of leaves that had fallen long before either of us arrived. He approached without words, and I accepted his silence without question. There was nothing to be said that would have meant more than the act itself. He bent down beside me, his joints stiff, his breath short. I could see the tremble in his hands as he reached toward my elbow, not grabbing, not insisting, just offering. I didn't meet his eyes. I didn't need to. The gesture wasn't apology. It wasn't guilt. It was simply acknowledgement. And in that moment, that was enough. I shifted slowly, letting the pain reintroduce itself. My body had not forgiven the night. My ankle flared as soon as it left its resting position, and my ribs felt bruised from the way I had leaned against the tree for too many hours. My hands dug into the soil for leverage. He supported me without words, guiding without control. We moved together, not in harmony, not in confidence, but in necessity. Standing was not triumph. It was labor. I rose in sections, one piece at a time, every movement watched over by the same trees that had seen me fall. My leg barely held me, so I leaned heavier into the walking stick. He didn't try to take it. He didn't offer an arm. He understood that this moment was not about being carried. It was about being witnessed standing. We didn't speak. The quiet between us was thick and meaningful, stretched by time and weighted by understanding. He hovered close, but not too close, learning finally the distance required to respect someone's pain. I didn't tell him I was ready. I simply began to move, slowly, inch by inch, retracing a path I didn't recognize. The forest had no signs, no markers, but something in the light told me which way the clearing opened. Each step was work. My injured leg dragged slightly, enough to leave a mark in the soft trail of leaves behind us. I felt the scratch of twigs on my shins, the uneven pull of damp earth underfoot. My balance wavered. I paused often. He waited each time, never impatient, never prompting, just waiting. At one point we passed a tree with a jagged scar along its trunk. I touched it as I passed, my fingers brushing the bark. The wound on the tree was old, healed in its own way, though the mark remained. I didn't need the metaphor. It lived itself. He stayed behind me, a few steps back, not out of shame, but understanding. He didn't try to lead. He didn't try to correct my pace or suggest a better way. He simply followed, not as a son walking with his father, but as a man returning beside someone he had once abandoned. The rhythm between us was slow and imperfect, but real. The walk took longer than it should have. My leg ached deeply. My foot began to numb. My hands cramped around the stick. But I didn't stop. I wasn't walking just to leave the forest. I was walking to prove I still could. Not to him, not to anyone, to myself. We came upon a small rise in the earth. Nothing dramatic, just a soft incline that under different circumstances would have passed without thought. But now, it was a mountain. I stopped at its base, staring upward, knowing what it would ask of me. I heard him shift behind me, felt his hesitation. He still didn't speak. I appreciated that. With effort, I climbed it, not quickly, not gracefully, but fully on my own. When I reached the top, I paused and looked out. There was no great view, just more trees. But the light had shifted slightly, less silver now, more pale gold. The sun was rising. The morning was real. At the bottom of the rise, I stopped again. My breath came hard, my legs trembling beneath me. He moved closer this time, but still didn't touch. I leaned against the stick, looked down at the space between us. It was not the space it had been before. We resumed walking. The path changed as we moved, less dense, more familiar. A faint imprint of our earlier footsteps lay scattered across the trail. I recognized none of it, but my body responded to the idea of returning. My heart knew we were near the edge. And then, through the trees, I saw the sliver of his car. Parked awkwardly, dust on the windshield, one tire slightly turned. It sat like a relic from another world, an intruder in the language of the woods. I didn't rush toward it. I didn't feel relief. It was just another object, another symbol, another step in the process of leaving something behind. He moved ahead now, retrieving the keys from his pocket, unlocking the door. I stood several feet away, staring at the shape of my reflection in the passenger window. I didn't recognize it, not because my face had changed, but because the person inside me had. He opened the door and waited. I took my time. My body moved stiffly, each motion deliberate. I turned, eased down into the seat. The cushion resisted at first, then gave in, unfamiliar, and too soft. He closed the door gently, walked around, entered on the driver's side. Still we said nothing. The engine started. The car filled with sound again. Air, mechanical motion, the low hum of modern life. It felt strange after so many hours of breathing with the trees. I turned my head toward the window, watching as the forest slowly disappeared behind us. We drove. No music, no apology, No conversation. Just the road, the sound of tires over gravel, the rise and fall of terrain beneath us. And beside me, the shape of a man who had walked back without knowing how to ask for forgiveness. And beside him, the shape of a man who had decided not to demand it. Our return was not a healing. It was a continuation, a wordless movement toward whatever came next. The drive back was quiet in the kind of way that doesn't beg to be filled. The tires hummed against the road, a low rhythmic sound that matched the slow ticking of the dashboard clock. We passed fields, mailboxes, gas stations that hadn't changed in decades. I recognized them all, not because they had grown familiar, but because they had never bothered to change. Just like me. The sky outside was a flat gray, not stormy, not clear. A middle ground. The kind of weather you don't remember the next day. He kept both hands on the wheel. His eyes stayed forward, scanning the road with a focus too tight to be natural. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. The weight in the car had already settled. There was no rearranging it. We sat in a space that wasn't about comfort or closure. It was about consequence. My body still ached. My ankle pulsed with each bump in the road, and my back throbbed from the long hours against bark and stone. But there was something else in me now. Not pain. Not relief. Something quieter. Heavier. I had carried my silence through the night, and now, in the light of day, it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like an answer. We pulled into my driveway without a word. The car idled for a moment longer than it needed to. He looked at the house the way one might look at a memory you're not sure you want to revisit. I waited. Not out of patience, but because I had no interest in making this easier for him. When he finally turned the engine off, the silence deepened. It was the kind of quiet that had layers, that reached down into things. He got out first, walked around to open my door. I didn't move right away. I sat for a moment longer, looking at the porch steps, at the door I had walked through thousands of times. Nothing about the house had changed, and yet it felt like I was seeing it after a lifetime away. I shifted slowly, using the stick to brace myself as I stood. He extended a hand, unsure. I didn't take it. I walked toward the house at my own pace. Each step was a quiet declaration. I was not fragile. I was not gone. I was here, present in my injury, in my awareness, in my silence. He followed behind me, unsure of his place in this procession. I didn't invite him in. At the door, I paused. My key turned stiffly in the lock. The click was louder than it had any right to be. The hinges sighed as the door opened, revealing the dim interior. I stepped inside. The air was familiar, dust and old wood, and something faintly floral from a candle long since burned out. I stood in the threshold for a moment, letting the silence settle over me like a coat I hadn't worn in a while. He stayed on the porch. I walked through the house, slowly. Each room met me like an old acquaintance, changed slightly, but still holding my shape. The living room, with its sunken cushions. The kitchen, with its chipped countertop and faded curtains. The hallway lined with photos I no longer glanced at. It all felt both distant and intimate, like a life I had once rented and now owned again. I made it to the back of the house, to the small den where I used to read. I lowered myself into the chair by the window, the one Ellen had upholstered herself, thread by thread. The cushion gave beneath me with a sigh. I leaned back, the walking stick resting across my knees, and closed my eyes. There was no triumph in me, no anger, just stillness. I heard the front door creak again. Soft footsteps. He had entered the house after all. I didn't turn around. I didn't call to him. I let him move through the space like a man walking through a museum of someone else's life. Every sound he made was a reminder of what he had done, of what he had almost undone, of what he could never take back. He paused in the hallway. I knew the exact spot, the place where the light from the kitchen met the edge of the rug. I imagined him standing there, looking at the photos on the wall. One of him as a boy, in my arms. Another, older, at a graduation. Smiling, because someone told him to. All frozen moments, framed in expectation. None of them told the truth. He stood there for a long time. I didn't speak. There was no ceremony in this. No speech that would make the past smaller. What we had now was reckoning, and reckoning is a solitary thing. I wasn't going to do the work for him. He turned eventually. I heard the front door again, the shuffle of feet, the slow click of it closing. Then silence. Complete. And I breathed. Not deeply, not freely, but completely. The house exhaled with me. I looked down at my hands, rough, tired, lined with time. They had held him once, held his mother, built this home board by board. They had typed lesson plans, dug gardens, folded sheets. They had aged in the background of everyone else's lives, and now they rested open in my lap, empty, but not lost. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Leaves scratched against the windows, soft and steady. The forest no longer pressed on me. It had let me go. But it had left its mark. Not visible, not bruised, etched deeper than that. This was my silence now. Not the silence of waiting. Not the silence of abandonment. But the silence that follows understanding. The kind that fills the space once held by resentment or hope, and replaces it with something more grounded. He would carry what happened. Maybe not in words, maybe not in confession, but in the way he walked, in the way he remembered the shape of my stillness, the way he'd see a forest now and feel the weight of what had been done inside it. And I had no interest in punishing him. I had no interest in teaching any further lessons. My silence had already taught him everything he needed to know. This was not revenge. This was reckoning. And reckoning, when done right, doesn't shout. It breathes. It endures. It waits.